Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction was launched at COP21, the UN Climate Convention's 21st Conference of the Parties held in Paris. With over 150 organizations, amongst which 30 countries, it is now the leading platform working to increase pace and scale of actions towards a zero-emission, efficient and resilient buildings and construction sector in all countries by 2050, and we're addressing both climate change mitigation and adaptation.
Le secteur du bâtiment est un secteur qui est fortement impacté par les changements climatiques et les bâtiments qui sont des espaces de vie essentiels, support de la vie sociale et économique, sont de plus en plus affectés par les aléas climatiques, ce qui met la sécurité et la santé de leurs occupants en danger. Et c'est dans ce sens que l'adaptation devrait occuper plus d'importance dans nos stratégies, nos planifications et nos actions. Et c'est dans ce sens que M. le ministre avait lancé un appel lors de la table ronde régionale de la Global Alliance du bâtiment et de la construction qui était organisée à Rabat au Maroc en octobre 2018 pour la mobilisation collective pour renforcer l'adaptation du secteur du bâtiment au changement climatique. Et dans le même cadre, la Global Alliance a créé un comité de travail dédié à l'adaptation. Et donc ce rapport vise essentiellement à constituer une base de discussion pour tout l'écosystème du secteur du bâtiment pour renforcer l'action de l'adaptation du secteur du bâtiment.
This report is based on interviews and on a large consultation process. The first section of the report refers to global challenges regarding adaptation of the built environment. The second deals with necessary changes in building sectors to better integrate adaptation challenges. The third and most important section presents a framework of action for different types of actors. It highlights the challenges faced by each of them and suggests recommendations to improve the adaptation of buildings to climate change. What are the key messages of this report? Climate change has an impact on buildings, which in turn affects the human life and economic activities they host. It is a question of safety and sustainability. Governments have a great responsibility to set, with the private sector, new rules. Implementation of rules and norms, such as a systemic approach, anticipation, long-term thinking and early prevention are necessary to adapt to climate change and have a resilient built environment. Therefore, context-based regulatory frameworks are needed. The Technical Building Code and Urban Planning Regulatory Framework should evolve in the way it is already evolving in few countries.
Standards on adaptation and resilience of building and construction works are an helpful tool that ensure adaptation will mitigate and prevent damage. Standards are powerful instruments to inform decision makers. Standards also facilitate the mainstreaming of measures and processes of adaptation to climate change. In particular, they provide a reliable reference framework that informs by describing proven adaptation approaches. In Europe, many standards on construction works, such as Eurocode, are being revised to incorporate adaptation to climate change and resilience in construction works. In ISO, the ISO 14019 on adaptation to climate change has been published in June 2019, and this horizontal standard will help experts to integrate climate change adaptation to sectorial standards. Works have begun in the construction sector.
In the building sector, the cost of inaction is far greater than the cost of action. The longer we wait, the higher the cost of adaptation and the cost of climate hazard impacts will be. Indeed, making infrastructure resilient can add 3% to the overall cost, but can avoid up to 4 times the cost of potential damages and emergency measures. Buildings are also major financial assets, and this links climate change risks to both the building and financial sectors. Integrating mitigation and adaptation measures at the beginning of a project is the source of savings. Improving reporting on climate risk exposure is the first step toward climate adaptation measures. Associating the whole value chain and integrating long-term issues is necessary. It implies to mobilize and mix different capabilities. To anticipate and avoid future costs, adaptation of buildings to climate change should be included in all phases of the construction project. Integrating climate change adaptation in buildings requires a systemic approach that goes beyond current practices, as they are often limited to short-term issues and contractual relationships. The need is now to focus on the extended life cycle phases to establish action frameworks dealing with adaptation. To set an example, engineers could take into account property developers' issues concerning adaptation while designing the project, and in the same way, constructors should include engineers' specifications on adaptation to climate change. Because of the lack of general access to tools and data to reinforce prediction and reinforce decision-making processes, short-sighted policies tend to be fostered when long-sighted policies and strategies would be needed. To deal with the consequences of climate change, the first step is assessing the risk or vulnerability. Risk studies and data are cross-sectional and require tools to be developed, shared among the sector and used by all actors. If some tools still do not exist, it is necessary to invest in their development.
There are three main challenges. The first challenge is to develop a shared understanding of the meaning of climate adaptation in the context of different scenarios, ranging from 2 degrees to a higher global warming trend and the related physical risk. Second challenge is to implement a full life cycle perspective, not only the construction of the building, but also including the entire life of the building, which means its operation and its maintenance, and when applicable, its renovation and decommissioning at the end of life. And the third challenge is to identify the role of the different stakeholders in order to reduce the vulnerability of the building. The framework of actions encompass different axes. The first axis is to develop an integrated approach. A second axis is to develop the capabilities, which means that it is important to train the engineers, the consultants, and to develop a dialogue and partnerships with the stakeholders all along the value chain. And the third axis is to promote, to support the development of methodologies, of tools, of data sets, of standards and also of regulation.
Et comme ça a été annoncé par Madame la Ministre lors de la COP25 à Madrid, donc le ministère de l'Aménagement du territoire national, de l'urbanisme, de l'habitat et de la politique de la ville, en partenariat avec la GlobalABC, et si bien sûr la situation sanitaire le permet, organiseront en 2021 la conférence internationale de l'adaptation du secteur du bâtiment au changement climatique. Cette conférence est pour réunir les différents professionnels, institutionnels et tout l'écosystème qui est concerné par l'adaptation du secteur du bâtiment au changement climatique.